Have you started? Great. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Yinuo, and I have the pleasure to have a conversation with William Poundstone or Bill Poundstone, who is on the screen as well. Bill, do you want to say hi to the audience?
Yes, hi. Good to be here.
It's wonderful to have this talk with you, Bill. And I'll just briefly say a few things about your work in Chinese as a start. 所以 Bill 的这本书叫做《如何打败一个像马一样大的鸭子》，听起来很有意思哈。那他的名字他的名字叫 Poundstone，然后叫庞斯通。然后他自己是一个非常非常有意思的作者，我们一会儿会讲到，然后大家可以在直播间里看到这本书的中文译版。All right. Okay, Bill. So people have, I think the first impression of people reading this book, probably just like mine, which is, what is this question? How to find a horse-sized duck. Yeah, maybe we start from there because I know like you've actually like also written another book which seems similarly crazy, which is how to make how to move Mount Fuji. Yeah, maybe we start a bit like so like people who are curious about this book or the name of the book, why?
Well, the origin really is a couple of years back, I started getting emails from friends who had been on job interviews. And I've always sort of had this reputation as someone who was very good at logic puzzles and stuff like that. I mean, even in high school. So people would say they were asked this crazy question on a job interview, and they basically wanted me to tell them the answer so that they'd know if they did well or not. And after a while, I got enough of these that I thought, hey, this seems to be a trend. There might be a book here. And I wrote the first book, How Would You Move Mount Fuji? Then I wrote another one, Are You Smart Enough to Work for Google? And then finally, the third one is, How Do You Fight a Horse-Sized Duck? So there's kind of three of them there. They've been over the years, but they've been quite popular books.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get to this book, I think I am definitely very intrigued by your own background. I think our audience won't mind listening to that too, because you studied physics as undergrad, right? From MIT. And then of course, if if people Google your name online, they will find you're a columnist, and of course you've published many books. And then those three are only sort of one branch of your books. There's a lot of books you've written. How did you come here? I know this is a long question, spending a long time, but no, from a physics major to this realm of work you're doing, yeah, share with us a bit of your background, how you kind of moved, along the journey.
Well, I always loved books. And even as a 12-year-old, I figured my dream job would be to be an author. And I didn't really know how to get into that particular line of work. But I was really interested in science. So I went to MIT, my dream school, took an undergraduate course in physics. But after I graduated, I went into publishing and I actually became an editor. And I always tell people I really think that was incredibly valuable because, I went through high school and college without really being told how to write, how to edit your own work, how to say things simply and clearly and all that good stuff. But I did learn that as an editor. And it's been incredibly valuable as an author. I mean, my editors tell me that they really don't have to make the type of changes that they do with other authors.
Wow. How did you qualify as an editor, as a PhD, I mean, as a physics graduate? How did you get yourself the first?
I guess they just didn't care who they were hiring, and I managed to get a job. But it worked out very well. I was only in it for about a year. After that, I sold my first book, and I've been writing books ever since.
Wow, I know. Wow, because if everybody's interested in look up William online, Poundstone is his last name. You will see a very long bibliography of his books. And then I think when I was just reading all those title of the books, I need to read that one. There's a long list of things that hopefully more publishers will be introducing your work to his audience. All right, now let's move on to the to the series that lead to this one, right? So because I don't even know, I'm actually in Tokyo right now. So when you talk about when I read the book, how would meet move Mount Fuji, I had a conversation with my son because I was, wow, there's an author I'm going to have a conversation with, and he wrote this book. I was asking, he's 14. I said, how would you do it if they ask you how to make Mount Fuji, how to move Mount Fuji? He's kind of clueless. I was like, oh, I think the way is to cut into pieces and then move it.
Yeah, well, that's usually an element of the common answers.
Right. But I think as what you just mentioned earlier, because those are so widely used in job interviews,
Mhm.
they seem to be odd. And so you decided to write this book, this most current book, the recent book,
Mhm.
How to Ride a Horse-Sized Duck.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in the book, you actually had a fascinating overview of the history
Mhm.
of interviews. Right. Can you tell us a bit like why you started so far deep in reaching to the past when coming to
Yeah.
analysis?
As I started looking into basically the history of interviewing and what sort of questions do you ask, what if anything really predicts how someone is going to perform on the job, I kept going further and further back and finding that it's not just the tech companies that invented this. I mean, you had it way before that, going back to Thomas Edison. And Edison was kind of notorious. He had this questionnaire that was basically trivia questions. Things like, how far is St. Louis from San Francisco? Which even if you're in the US is not something you normally know. But Edison had this idea. I mean, he got all these great engineers applying to work with him because he was famous for his engineering and everyone wanted to. But Edison was of the opinion that it's easy to tell when someone is competent in engineering, but he felt he needed something more than that. And he felt that it was very important to hire people who pay attention to the world around them and remember things like that. So hence his trivia test. And again, he was quite successful in his hiring, and this became quite popular for a time there. It also was controversial. A lot of people said, why do you have to know these things? So I kind of go into how psychologists and human resources people have tried to actually do research and find, what type of questions really are predictive of job performance. And one of the things they find is that it's very hard to establish almost anything in the science of hiring. So a lot of people are going on instincts and so forth. But certainly these types of questions that I cover in these three books have become a big part of the picture.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. For everyone who's interested in reading this book, this is what Bill just mentioned is at the beginning of the new book, which is fascinating. I think he talked about how Edison had this notorious, almost, right, you can call it famous questionnaires, which get released, I guess somehow get released,
Yeah.
or people who have attended those interview, try to remember what they were asked and kind of compose this list.
Yeah, it was revealed in the New York Times, and Edison was really upset about that. He said he was going to make up a new questionnaire and copyright it, so if anyone used it in the future, he would be able to sue them.
Right.
But even the second version of the questionnaire got released eventually, so he
Right.
really didn't do much about that.
Indeed. And I had no idea until reading your book and talking about actually in 1921 alone, the New York Times, we all know this is like, it's a major
Yeah,
article, very article, around 23 articles and editorials on this question.
yes. This was like some incredible pop culture phenomenon at the time.
Right. Yeah, yeah. So as you said, because your second book is how, are you good enough to be, I guess, for Google? And then I think that the Edison's firm was sort of the Google equivalent back then, right?
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
Yeah, so people all wanted to know, oh, what kind of what is this genius coming up with to test people? And then, am I good enough? But as Bill just mentioned, actually, it's almost laughable because actually there's no evidence that those, how well you answer those questions actually, correlate to your competency, especially around that time. Those trivia questions is really based on, I think you named it very sharply and saying this is basically a affluent male man's world, right? So like, I would know
Yes.
those facts. And then there's the questions like which countries, surround France, like, like
Yeah.
you have to be sort of in certain class. Right. But then that has moved because then, from the Edison sort of that cultural phenomena and going to this sorts of questions. I think you have a word called, is that Barnum effect? Did I remember it right? Meaning basically showing that it's not working. What is that?
Oh,
Barnum?
Barnum, that's what you
Barnum.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you mind talking a little bit about that? I think that's also a very interesting twist there.
Yeah, Barnum ran a circus and was kind of a showman in the US, and he loved to fool people. So he was kind of notorious for that. And the Barnum effect means it's very easy to fool people when you come up with any sort of psychological evaluation. They've done psychology tests where they will give people, they will ask people to fill out some sort of test, and they'll say, this is a psychological evaluation, and here's what we found. And they'll say things like, we found that you're someone who is very confident, yet you have insecurities, and you feel that you don't always communicate with people the way you want, and things like that. And people will say, yes, you nailed it. That's totally the way I feel. But these things were just taken randomly from like astrology magazines or something and really had no effect whatsoever. But still, people want to believe it. If you tell people something that's kind of generally upbeat, generally what they want to believe, and present it with authority, it's very easy to believe that. So I think in all these fads in hiring, there's certainly an element of that going on.
Yeah. No, indeed. And then I think also because it's interesting, as if you're reading about history, but it's not history. Even today is the same, right?
Yes.
That's why.
Human nature doesn't change much.
Right. Even like that's why the palm reading industry is so big.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so that's kind of talking about the absurdity, but I think that's also then you move on. There's a part of the book that talk about sort of the discussion of being fair, right? Because I think we're saying we know, like for example, the Edison's story. Obviously, that approach isn't fair because if you are not in that particular class, there's no way you know those facts. Although but this is probably common knowledge for him. And then there is this whole discussion, I think, around the whole race norming from 1970s and then was canceled in 1991. Yeah, and then maybe tell us about that piece of history, like why then suddenly, when people are reflecting on those questions, they're trying to be more fair, but then because the attempt at trying to be fair created more problems in interviews later on.
Yes, in the 1970s, there were a number of very key lawsuits in the US. One involved Duke Power, which was an electric power company. And they were just blatantly discriminating against their Black employees. They paid them less and everything else. With the Civil Rights Act, it became illegal to do that. But they sort of tried to get around it by saying, okay, we're going to require people to pass an IQ test, or have a college degree in order to get into the higher amount of salary and the better jobs. But the Supreme Court eventually decided that that was unfair because most of the Black employees, first of all, they hadn't taken IQ tests. They weren't really, schooled in that. They were much less likely just economically to have a college degree. So the point was that they were in effect discriminating against these people for no really good reason. And they ruled that even if a criterion was nominally neutral, such as saying, well, we're going to pay people more if they have a college degree, if you couldn't show there was a real need to have a college degree, and these were jobs where you were, out repairing phone lines or electric lines or something, it was really irrelevant. So the Supreme Court said you had to really show that something is relevant to the job, is a good predictor for job performance. And as I say, the problem is that it's very hard to prove almost anything in hiring. So this really changed how people hire in the US. And there's much, much greater emphasis on not discriminating against people arbitrarily, on trying to make sure that anything you do, even if it seems very neutral, is really going to be fair to everyone. So that's really one of the major things in the history of hiring. And I do go into that at quite some length in the book.
Yeah. this is a fascinating part because I think as I worked, of course, many years in the US, of course, as a Asian woman, and I was actually quite, in a way, grateful, thankful. Every time you go interview, there is the statement, okay, this whatever organization is, non-discriminatory, that there is a, we don't discriminate people based on on race, on, color of your skin, or culture, religion, or whatever. And then, of course, I was grateful, but I also didn't really know much about the history, how kind of it moved to that stage. And then that's what Bill said in his book. He went into depth of, the few major lawsuits. Those are sort of turning points, but there are also a lot of movements a lot of research, and a lot of advocacy in the, in between to get to this stage. And of course, we can argue even today is far from perfect, but, dipping into history, you will know it was so much worse back then.
Well, also, you're finding today all sorts of AI-enhanced screening and employment procedures. They claim to be able to remove that bias, which is a promising claim, but it's hard to tell. And most of them really don't divulge all the information that you'd need to know in order to determine if they've actually achieved that freedom from bias. But it's certainly a consideration in marketing these things.
Right. Yeah. So I want to take a pause here and to say what we discussed just now was all in part 1 of the book. So the book is organized in 3 parts. And part 1 is a short history of assessment. It is short compared to the real history, but it's still very extensive. I think it's very educational for us to understand, for things like we take for granted today. Okay, job interviews, you get into, you solve some problems, you solve some puzzles, you answer some questions. And how did we get here? And then there are a lot of absurdity in the history, which I'm sure back then it feels more normal. Right? And it's like, it's like this self-correction process that actually has run for over a century to get to where we are. And then Bill went into depth into a few of them as he talked about. So before we move on to the second part of the book, which get to more sort of the current era, but I think even in the first one, there are a few things that kind of struck me. One is you talked about this whole effect of blind audition. I think probably, some audience probably know. If you don't, the blind audition is something, it's very interesting. It's being used in sort of the orchestra auditioning, like where they put the player behind the curtain so that you can really see if they're male or female, how they look like, and then the color of their skin. And then that ended up creating this huge difference in hiring compared to you look at the player, and basically saying this sort of unconscious bias. I think that kind of also what's made that word popular. But you actually in the book went to this data, which was very interesting. Actually, was actually done by Claudia Golding. Of course, people probably know more because of the Nobel Prize in 2023. But she was the one that actually went sort of dig into the data and looked at the effect of that blind audition, sort of applying at a wider spectrum. Maybe you can share with us a little bit of that data, that kind of what's uncovered through her research.
Yeah, I should explain that I mean they're very serious about this. They will not only have a blindfold behind or in front of the performer, but they'll even make sure to put carpet so that when they enter, you can't hear their footsteps, because sometimes you can tell, even if unconsciously, whether that's a man or a woman from the footsteps. So really, when you have no idea whether it's a man, woman, what the ethnicity is, what Golding found was that it made a huge difference in the number of women hired and the number of minorities hired. And this has had a continuing effect in increasing the diversity of our, symphony orchestras. So that's kind of become, I might almost say, a paradigm in various new types of hiring techniques, like these psychometric games. They really take the blind audition as the example. They want to do something like that, something that truly screens out all this, human unconscious bias. It's a very tough thing to do, but I think it's kind of a noble goal.
Yeah, yeah. And then it kind of brought it to life as well, because I recently had a kind of online panel around career development for Asians, especially in the US. And one of the panelists, the co-panelists they invited, was this professor from Hawaii, and she's Japanese, and her research is in the sort of music industry. And she said, as you know, now there are so many more Asians in the industry. And then the reason was, really triggered or, kind of get propelled by the blind audition, because it wasn't the case before. And then, so this is actually, as you said, is a really paradigm shift and moved here. But of course, that will also lead people to think otherwise, okay, this is music, right? And then you can do it without looking. But there are many things you can't, like if you're interviewing somebody who's a salesperson, right?
Yeah.
Or you're interviewing somebody who's, even a programmer, somebody who will show up in your office and work next to you, you can't, right? So like, are there some efforts addressing that as well?
Well, a lot of hiring these days starts with some sort of screening on a phone, usually. You have a short interview there. You may play what they call psychometric games. And all of these have been shown to be fairly effective at getting more minority applicants to the next stage, which is the face-to-face interview. So I think a lot of the bias in hiring does happen at these very early stages. I mean, there's an almost chilling study where these researchers sent out resumes that were basically identical to companies, except some had a so-called black sounding name and some had a white sounding name. And invariably, they found that the white sounding names were much more likely to get callbacks. And this was just as true at companies that have, diversity and equity and inclusion in their mission statements. So there's clearly a problem here that we need to be aware of.
Right. I think they have done the same with just changing the resume with the male or female name.
Yes.
Same. Yeah. Similarly, because I'm doing this exchange scholar thing in Japan. Japan the same, because it's very obvious if it's a female name or a male name. There's a different way they name them. So also it's very hard to, to ignore.
Yes.
It's quite difficult. Yeah. All right. And then that kind of come to the after the blind audition. You actually, towards the last part of the short history, you actually landed on creative problem solving. And in that book, you talked about the whole sort of genesis of it and dating back to, to the ancient Rome, right? Like how this kind of thinking,
anyway, yeah.
Right, how this thinking came about. And how it has evolved in getting the current day. I think you mentioned this physicist who had this book called How to Solve It, right? So which is sort of the nerd book. Polia's book.
Mathematician, actually, George Polia.
George Polia, on the book. I think the book was 1945, right? So it was,
that sounds about right, and it still sells quite well.
Right, so it was meant for more for the public, right? So it isn't meant as a
Yes, it's a very simple, easy to understand book, and it gives just various techniques for solving pretty much any sort of problem that requires creative thought. And I actually took many of his basic tips and incorporated them into this book because they do apply to many of the questions that are being asked in job interviews.
Right. And then I think but I have a question. I want to know a bit of your thinking process. Why do you put creative problem solving into the short history part? Is it because now this is more the current day, how the assessment has evolved to creative problem solving?
Yeah, well, I want to show that there's kind of nothing new under the sun. And when you look at any of these things, you find that they do have precursors, even if they seem like a very 21st century thing. In fact, the interviewers who ask these type of questions will often tell you that they're looking for 21st century skills. And by that, they mean, creative problem solving, even media literacy, being good at collaborating, all sorts of things like that. But they really do have a history behind them.
Yeah. And then the history is very consistent, I think, going back to Yeah, I think that's what Bill is trying to get to in this book, and it's just saying like, you know, all those 21st century skills.
Mhm.
If you ask if you dig into what they're asking, those
Mhm.
are things that's been stated many times very clearly in the past.
Yeah.
I
And
want to show that.
part of what that means is that creative problem solving is not a total mystery. I mean,
Right.
there are certain techniques you can use, techniques you can learn. So even
Yeah.
if you're not good at it, it's not a permanent thing. I mean, you can really train yourself on that, which
Yeah.
is a pretty important thing to know.
Right, right. Yeah, indeed. I think that's part of the point of this book, right? So if you
Mhm.
if you read this book, understanding what's kind of the underlying thread of those questions, and
Yeah.
then you can train yourself, you can ace any interview.
I mean, it is a self-help book in the sense that you don't have to be good at this to start. You can read the book and really learn how to be like these people who are so good at answering these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to read. I actually copied a excerpt from your book and talking about how Polya, when we talked about the, you know, in his book How to Solve It, and talk about the 21st century problem solving, right? But of
Yeah.
course that's 20th century. But he basically says, I'm going to read it aloud. What's in the book? He said Polya says that the first step of problem solving is to understand the problem. Okay, pretty clear, right? Understand what you're
Yeah.
doing. And the second is to make a plan. Okay, once you know the problem, you make a plan. And the third is to carry out the plan.
Yeah.
And then you're saying with luck, it succeeds. When it
Yeah.
does, yeah, Polya suggests looking back at the problem and the solution and
Mm.
ask whether you can learn anything from the experience.
Mhm.
And then it ends it saying problem solving is a lifetime thing, and you should try to learn from every success or failure.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, it's very succinct and it's very, yeah, it's very true.
Yeah.
You
Well,
can't
it's
deny.
also, as I say, it's also very helpful in an interview because
Right.
one of the first rules in an interview is that you've got to keep talking. You've got to, articulate what's going on in your head, even if you're kind of panicking and don't have any idea what to say. So a good way to start is to make sure you understand the problem. Kind of put the problem that you've just been asked in your own words to make sure that you do understand the basic elements. And if you get something wrong, I mean, even the most flinty-hearted interviewer is going to say, no, what I said is this. So it's a good way to get familiar with it. You kind of buy time where you can start to figure what you're going to do next. And then you start to have a plan and you can articulate that plan, which is another way of, kind of passing it in front of the interviewer. Usually from his body language, you can get an idea of whether you're on the right track or the wrong track. I mean, it's like the game where you say you're hotter or you're colder. You can get a lot of clues that way. And then you basically carry out that plan and hopefully you come to the solution.
Yeah. Here you go. That's so true because when you were talking, I just remembered that's exactly the advice we give to interviewers or I guess candidates who came to interviews. That's back, you know, like a decade ago in my career, McKinsey time. I think the first thing you do in any interview, if you ask your question, is to basically articulate the question in your own words and
Mhm.
confirm if this is what they mean. Because oftentimes the interviewers, the candidates are so nervous that they say if they feel like if I ask a clarifying question, that means I'm
Mhm.
done. Okay,
Yeah.
that means I didn't get what they're asking. That will, you know, be negative,
Yeah.
on their impression on me. But it's actually the opposite. If you you might just go down the wrong rabbit hole if you
Yes.
didn't really know what the question was.
Mhm.
But that was a very common mistake. It's a very simple things like that actually can really
Mhm.
save you an interview.
Yeah. No,
But
absolutely. A big part of succeeding in interviews is managing your own psychology. And, it's normal to be a little nervous, but you have ways of dealing with that.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think that's, you know, as I mentioned in the beginning, we can only scratch the surface of the book. I had a
Mhm.
pleasure of reading it, but I still feel there's many parts that I kind of have to glance through because I don't have enough time. And
Mhm.
there are a lot of references in the book. So do get a copy of the book. 大家可以在直播间买到这本书的中文版，非常非常有意思啊！这里面的很多我们讲到的内容在书里都有。Okay, that was my chipping Chinese sales pitch.
Much
Okay,
appreciated.
so yeah, so that's the first part of of the book about a short history. As I said, I think even although it feels like it's a history, but it really talks about how the current day interview questions has become what it is now. As Bill has mentioned, there's nothing new under the sun. Even things get, you know, like a new sort of a new package of 21st century, whatever, but actually the essence, what people are trying to get to, or what they're trying to, the quality they're trying to find is in essence very similar to the core questions people have been asking since like thousands of years ago. and approach are similar too at a fundamental level. Of course, the problem on surface is different, right? So you are faced with different type of real world issues, but the gist of it is the same. So I think this first part of the book gave you know, sort of have shown this golden line of kind of evolution of how interviews has evolved. Alrighty. Again, and then now I want to move on to the first part of the book. First part of the book, Bill named it mind games, and then it was very interesting because it starts. The book is very readable. It's very fun to read. For example, this second book talked about how this German psychologist Wolfgang Köhler was, you know, with marooned in the Canary Islands with 9 chimpanzees. Tell us why you start with that story and what is that story?
Well, that's about the whole idea of a conflict move. This psychologist would perform experiments on the chimpanzees where he would take a banana and kind of hide it in various places, and the chimpanzees would have to find it or find a way to get it. And he found that when he would put the banana behind like a fence or a cage or something, the chimpanzee would start by just staring at it through the cage and realize he couldn't reach and get it. But then he realized he could go around the fence and get the banana. And this is what's known as a conflict move. To solve a lot of types of problems, you have to do something that seems wrong. You have to go further from the solution in order to finally get closer and then get the banana. And this is a very basic principle of problem solving that's involved in a lot of the questions and psychometric games that I'm talking about here. And I think it's maybe the quintessential idea that's at the center of all really creative problem solving.
Yeah, it's going around, and then you mentioned this case called the Tower of Hanoi, which is a game, which is in essence similar, right?
Yes, it's a game. It's an actual physical game where you've got these discs on various rods and you have to move them according to certain rules. But now they've adapted it so that you can do it on your phone for job interview screening. And it's exactly about these conflict moves. The way to succeed is invariably to move the disc in ways that seem wrong, but are actually essential to actually arriving at a solution.
Yeah. I think for people in the Chinese culture, they're familiar with this one too. There are many kind of games or even like toys are like that. And the Hanoi Tower is one. And I was fascinated to find out.
Not actually from Vietnam, but that's the name it was marketed by.
Yeah, I know exactly. That's what I learned from your book. It's nothing to do with Hanoi. I don't know why they find maybe Hanoi is a fancy Oriental name or something.
Yeah, I guess so.
But it was saying that exactly. It's basically meaning like 我们叫中文叫迂回 There's a Chinese word for it too. Like how do you actually go around a problem, or you almost you have to go west if you want to go east, but you have to go first, and then that's where you discover the key and come to the east the part of it. So and this part is called talking about taking a detour. So I think again I want to say in this book is in the second chapter, I think Bill is trying to, well, I'm putting words in your mouth, which correct me if I'm wrong. Like I think you were trying to kind of show different type of mind games, right?
Yes.
And
by that I mean the games that are actually used for screening in job interviews. You generally have to go to a certain website on your phone, do these various games, and if you get a high enough score, you'll then be asked to come in for an actual interview.
Right. Yeah. So those part, I think in a way, when I was reading this book, I was like, wow, like if I don't know how I made it into McKinsey myself, but actually I've read this book. Have read this book because basically I think Bill is trying to in this second chapter and talking about the different kind of mind games and
Mhm.
what's the sort of the essence of it, right? So like on
Yeah.
surface, it could be different kind of websites and different kind of like, you know, a form or formats. But Bill is trying to, in this chapter, in this part of the book, and talking about, okay, for example, that one we talk about taking a detour and talking about that category of strategy works. And then the second, they move on. So that's what you're trying to convey to the readers in the second part of the book,
Yeah.
right?
Very much so.
Alrighty. Okay. And then also I think I want to say, in addition to what we just talked about in theory, but there's the book is very rich in all kind of examples and sample questions you could ask. And then so like I was even thinking if you have children at home, you know, like, or you know, probably they don't have to, they have to be certain age. They can't be too small. 3-year-olds may be too difficult. But you have like teenager children or somewhere around that time frame. It will be fun to do some of them with them too, right?
No, I mean, why all three books kind of appealed to me is because it's a very practical thing, but it's also a very fun thing if you're at least into puzzles and so forth. So there's a real entertainment value as well as something very practical.
Right, exactly. And and then actually in current day, there's a lot of those games are actually already adapted online. So like people actually can
Yes.
find one online in doing that, right?
Yes.
All right. And then the second part of we talked about the first one of taking a detour, and then you come to this part called Explore, Plan, Act, and there was this air pump or air
Yes.
a balloon game, right? Can you explain
Yes.
a bit like that? Why you putting that game as an example?
Well, it's a game they actually use in screening people for certain jobs. The way it works, you press a button that blows up a balloon on screen. And each time you press the button, the balloon gets a little bigger. But at some point, and it's a random point, you don't know when it's going to be, the balloon burst if you do one too many pushes. So they ask people to try and blow up as many balloons as they can without bursting them, because then you'll get points. And they found that this is a good measure of someone's attitude towards risk. And they've also found, or at least it's claimed, that your scores on this particular game correlate to certain job descriptions. So they try to match people who have the right risk profile for a particular job. So this is one way. There's no right or wrong answer to this. But if they're trying to match you to a particular job, this supposedly can be very useful.
Yeah. And there's even a big acronym for it called,
Yes.
called the BART score.
Yeah.
Yeah, but as Bill said, I think many of it was eye-opening to me reading this book, is saying like lots of those tests actually has very extensive psychological research
Yes.
behind it, right? So this particular one called the BART, called basically balloon analog risk task.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a team of actually psychologists from University of Maryland, and then the work was published in 2002. And basically, as Bill said, it's an interesting measure to measure you towards trade-off of risk and a reward. I think many people know about the marshmallow test, and the marshmallow test is sometimes is more like time versus reward. Like the more you wait, the more you get rewarded. And this one is risk versus reward. Sometimes, like you try too much, you blow up everything, you fail. But if you don't take any risks, right, you don't get the maximum possible reward for it too. So like all those kind of looks like simple, almost childish games actually has a quite extensive psychological design research behind it, right?
Yeah. And the companies that distribute these tests for companies in hiring have generally, they've got psychologists on staff who are very familiar with these particular games, so they've adapted it into their commercial software.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to kind of go back a little bit on that, because you actually in the book mentioned this testing, or maybe testing is the wrong word, but assessment is actually a $500 million industry. I remember you mentioned in your
Yes,
book.
it's a very big industry now. And again, just in the past few years, I mean, these phone apps have become, a very big part of hiring.
Yeah, indeed. So I think one of the things, it was so interesting because you mentioned the big five earlier in your first part of the book. where it's a personality predictor, right? Or not a predictor, I guess an analyzer. So actually, I recently had a conversation with a professor in China. She talked about this Big Five model specifically. And I actually didn't know until I read your book, it was actually devised by this two Air Force psychologists, right?
Yes, very obscure Air Force psychologist. And they published it in, an Air Force psychology journal, and it got no attention whatsoever. But
Right.
as the years went by, some of their work was kind of duplicated by better known psychologists. And then finally, they started doing research and realized, hey, these two guys in the Air Force did all this 20 years ago. So they finally did get their due. But yeah, that's where it comes from.
Right, right. It was like 1960s or something there when
Yeah.
they first published their book. Yeah, and also now it become because the reason I mention it is like if you're Chinese, you've read this book for that's been now published in Chinese, and then like it's 2024.
Yeah.
I was like 60 years after. I know we talk about all that, but like again, as Bill said, I think that's why it's such an interesting side of the book, because it go down to a lot of the root of the history, like who did the work back then, and then although it's really kind of became popular, decades down the road, but that was this you can actually track them how different work get connected. Yeah, and then so you talk about then this, when you talk about mind game, this one is about the risk one. Also, there's a lot of cards, but games you can play with cards. But again, I think people are using it online, right? The online version of it.
Yeah.
To play. Yeah. And then so I won't get to all of it because I'm going to make you want to read the book itself. So get the book, because in this book, in the second part, again, as Bill said, he's basically trying to make this book a self-help book. Like you actually can read this book and first of all know what kind of tests are being put out there. And second, what's sort of the essence of those kind of tests? Like, what are they trying to test, and then what is it based on? What are the principles they're building upon, and what's the research that led to it? I think then most of all, then knowing all that, and how do you prepare for it, right?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of a case of forewarned is forearmed. This is such a new thing that most people, when they first encounter these tests, have no idea what's going on. So I think it just helps to know a little about the history and what they're looking for. And in most cases, there aren't really right or wrong answers for this. It's just about matching you to a particular job.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But I think when you say that, I think even probably some of the job interviewer don't really know what is the based on either.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
Because now there's such a big supply of all kind of tests, right? Saying, okay, then, and then as you mentioned, there's AI, then, I can use this tool and that tool to screen. So I think it doesn't matter if you're somebody who is applying for a job and preparing for an interview, or if you're working on the other side of the door, right? So if you're an HR person or your company trying to find the right talent, understanding those assessments and what it tells, and first of all, what's true, what's bogus, as you said, is it Barnum effect? Is it, did I pronounce
Barnum effect.
Barnum effect? Yeah. So like lots of them tell you nothing. It looks sophisticated, but like you don't have to do any test for that, to show any results, which means it's completely bogus. So if you're spending money on that type of test, you're really not getting anything useful from it. Versus the real ones, and also understanding even for the real ones you're using, what's the psychological sort of root or the research root beneath it. So how to kind of almost decipher the results, right?
Yes.
All right. Perfect. And then I think I want to go take one more here, because I think that was also a fascinating one you mentioned earlier too, which is the one you give money. You take you and your partner, between $0 to $5. I think like you give them some money, then maybe explain that game a bit, because I think that's also very revealing. Seems to be a very simple game, but tells a lot.
You're given, supposedly, I mean, this is virtual money, but you're given $5, say. And you're allowed to give part of that to another person. And any part you give to that other person will be tripled in value. So if I give you $2, it'll magically change into $6. But then you are allowed to give me back something as well. So the question is, how much would I give to you? Now, logically, if we were cooperating, I should give you the whole $5. It would become $15, and then you could maybe give me back $7.50, and we'd both be ahead.
Yep.
Of course, we're complete strangers. We don't know each other. We can't confer on this. So the question is, how much do you just trust someone who may be a stranger? And that's basically what this measures. And it's believed to be a good measure of how well you get along with others, whether you're very individualistic or more collaborative. And they say that if you're in a financial occupation, usually those people will not give very much money because they're, kind of self-centered in that way. But if you're something like a school teacher, a nurse, a very nurturing profession, usually they give a lot of money and hope to get more back that way. So in that sense, it makes, the rationale makes a certain sense, I think, in terms of deciding who's going to be good for a particular job.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm surprised to find out, I think you mentioned in the book that the average like money amount that people give out. I think, before I reveal that, if you're listening to this conversation, you should ask yourself, like, how much are you willing to give out to the partner? Like, again, you don't really know how much they're going to give back to you. And I think the average data is about half, right?
Yeah. Yes. So most people are pretty collaborative that way. They are willing to put their trust in a stranger.
Right, right. But I'm actually very curious. I don't know if they've done that. I wonder if they can further dice the data. Let's say if you separate it by age or by gender or by culture or by that, I'm very curious what that data would look like. Or are they all half, or like in certain cultures or certain age group, depends on your life experience, or of course you also mentioned by profession. Like what's
the data I've seen, and I think this is mostly in the US, women are somewhat more willing to give more money than men on average, and younger people are more willing to do it than older people.
I see.
Which
okay.
kind of goes in with some of the stereotypes, I guess.
Right, right. Wow, that's interesting. Okay. And as I said, in the second part of the book, there are many, quite a few. Basically, I think Bill has categorized different type of archetypes of mind games. And then there are examples of, you can understand what kind of games are being asked. And also, as we mentioned, and Bill also go very deep into how those games were developed and what belief it's based on. What are they trying to test? Right.
Yes.
But I think I wonder, one of the questions I have though, Bill, is that, like, can you really prepare for this kind of questions? Because almost sometimes it feels like they're like that giving your partner money thing. It's more a testing of almost kind of who you are, rather than like, I'm not going to change my answer. And if I change, I'm kind of manipulating the test, right? So
the only reason you would have to change your answer is if you know that the profession you're trying to get a job in corresponds to a certain type of answer in it. But even in then, I mean, I don't see there's a whole lot of incentive there. I mean, you should these are personality tests. You should be yourself. And, if they match you to a different sort of job, so be it. Yeah.
Yeah. But you also did mention, I think also somewhere in the book, I don't remember where, that it does have certain sort of factor. For example, if English isn't your first language.
Yes.
Or is there, certain connotations that you don't understand what they're asking? Those type of questionnaires actually come across, and people would stumble on that. But I guess that's difficult to address. Or are there efforts in addressing those as well?
Well, I'm not sure that they do that in the commercial software so much, but in my book, I mean, I think it is useful to be familiar with the underpinnings of each game, knowing what the rules are, because they don't often explain it that well. You kind of need a moment to let it sink in. So it is helpful to know what you're going to be dealing with in advance.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Great. So again, as you probably, I think this is almost like a test prep book for going into an interview with unknown tests, right? But like, this is only those categories. I think that's what this book is trying to do. All right. I think now we move on to the third part, which is puzzles. And is it mind games? What's the puzzles? And sorry, I don't. Anyway, this puzzles part where I think I'll cut to the chase where this is the name of the book comes across, right? That was one question, is would you rather fight one horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses? First of all, is this a real question? I suppose it is.
Yes, it's a real question that I've heard from several people who have actually encountered it.
Right.
And I guess the way this question works is that you're supposed to use your ingenuity to find a way of answering it that isn't totally stupid. Certainly, one way of interpreting it is metaphorically. Would you rather have like one big problem or many small problems? And that sort of makes sense. If you're dealing with the public, you probably realize that it's just as hard to deal with many problems as it is to deal with one big problem. So maybe you'd rather have the one big problem, and that could be a sensible answer for something like this. But there's other approaches to take. You could look at it kind of scientifically and rather literally. You can figure that a horse-sized duck would be, huge, and based on change of scale, it probably would have trouble just moving because it wouldn't, the duck legs wouldn't be able to support the weight of a horse-sized, duck body. So in that case, a horse-sized duck really wouldn't be much of a threat. And you could worry about those 100 duck-sized horses because they would be much stronger relative to their weight and dimensions. And if there's 100 of them, so you should be afraid of them, I think.
Yeah. But I think the essence of this question, I think you also said it in the book, is that I think for somebody who's encountering this question, the first thing you need to know is that there isn't one correct answer.
Yes,
right? So
obviously not. Question.
Yeah, there is but I think that's a very important preparation, because especially for people who in the East Asian culture, there is one right answer. Okay, so like because all the tests come up to an answer, like you choose C and then that you're right, A, B, D are wrong. Or there's a certain value you're after. But I think all those kind of questions, that's the first principle. There isn't a right answer. Isn't okay, the horse-sized duck is the better one to fight. There isn't such a thing, but rather the questions are designed for the interviewers to understand almost the layers of your thinking.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so you should use this as an opportunity to demonstrate the layers of your thinking. I think just now Bill gave an excellent example. Like you could say, okay, there's, first of all, if you use the issue tree, there are two ways, right? One is metaphorically, one is literally, right? And then if we go down first, the literal one first, then you can think about, okay, what's the physics? What's the possibility of a horse-sized duck? And that's how because I was testing with my kid this morning this question, and that's how they reacted. They said, "Oh, a horse-sized duck will collapse." So
well, that's a good answer.
So like I'll fight that. It's very easy, and I don't need to fight. It's going to die on its own. And then or you can say, tiny horses are more pesty and all that, and you can go up to the second tree, the branch of the issue tree, saying, oh, you can also say this metaphorically. This is one big problem or a lot of small problems. I think by just articulating through this thinking process is sometimes what interviewers are looking for. They say, oh, this guy or this gal isn't, like I'm going to throw the right answer, just, gave me the score. But this is the way he or she can think about it. And then the multiple layers they can break down into understanding the problem. And also each level they break down, they actually have, a rationale or, a foundation to it. It's not just random, kind of throw of ideas, but there is a structure to thinking, right?
Yes, Joe Spolsky, who was a longtime interviewer at Microsoft, told me that the point of these offbeat questions is really to have a conversation. And from the conversation, you can tell how talented the candidate is. So
Yeah.
again, it's not that there's one answer they're looking for, it's how you justify what you do say.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. I think that's why you in the book you said it's interview riddles often work like essay questions.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So you because
Yeah,
it's
you
a
know,
class.
you can judge someone's mind from how they answer an essay question, even if they end up saying something that you kind of disagree with.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think this is really the essence of those kind of questions. Like, it's not to arrive at a particular answer, but it's a opportunity to demonstrate how you think of the problem.
Yeah,
And usually this is a problem that's new, right? You haven't studied for it. Because usually when you think about the test, okay, I studied for 1 semester, right?
yeah,
I mastered all the concepts, I memorized all the formula, and now I'm doing all the calculation. And that's kind of how people think about it. But this is almost like you walk into a class you've never attended.
yes,
And suddenly you're at the final exam. But the essence of the question are different. I think that's what you're trying to convey. Like basically, how do we mentally adjust to this type of questions, and how do you really approach it?
yeah. Well, some people, I mean, it is very hard. If you're used to the idea that there is a right answer to everything, I mean,
Yeah,
you sort of have to realize that this isn't how a lot of these questions work.
yeah, exactly. So I think that's the core around all those kind of looks like it's a puzzle, but it's
Yeah,
not like solving a puzzle, because solving a puzzle you can do it on your own there, and there is a sort of a perfect answer, right? Because if you're solving a puzzle,
yeah,
there is an answer. You have to put it together this way.
yeah,
And but actually in lots of the questions, they're not like that.
yeah. Or at
Yeah,
least they kind of challenges. And the interviewer basically hopes that they hear something from you, maybe that they haven't heard before, if it's
right.
well reasoned, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And then I want to say that this book and the third part is full of this very interesting questions. And then I think Bill is very generous. He basically helped you answer all of them.
Yes.
Yeah, so if you're interested in understanding, first of all, seeing what kind
Yeah.
of questions are being asked,
Mhm.
and second, and then learning from Bill, like who is one of the brightest minds, and how he help you or help us as a reader to decipher those problems,
Mhm.
right? And then how do you sort of answer them? I think this is the you and then this is really a best ROI for an investment because the
Yeah.
book is really cheap. Compared to compared to whatever job training you have. I think
Mhm.
there's another one I want you to answer or show us. I think a lot of people will be interested. There was a question you asked is that if there were a machine that produced $100 a year for life,
Mhm.
what would you be willing to pay for it today?
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah,
well, that's one where a lot of these questions are actually kind of covert ways of seeing whether you understand things that are important in business.
right.
And in this, they're basically asking about the concept of present value. You're essentially saying you've got an annuity that gives you $100 a year. How much would that be worth? And you can calculate that, and even in your head, and it would be about like 27,000 or $2,700, which is a pretty good off the cuff answer. And if you can justify that, they're really quite impressed with that.
Mhm. Yeah, and then then there are many things like that. It's actually building on certain concepts that are pretty common
Yeah,
in business.
money is more valuable now than money later. And as it
Yeah,
gets further and further in the future, it has less and less value. And
yeah,
again, no matter what sort of business you're in, that's something you're going to have to deal with. So they want to make sure that their employees are at least, have some familiarity with the concept.
absolutely. Yeah, and then there are other parts of this third chapter around a third part of the book around, for example, how do you break a big problem into smaller parts, right?
Mhm.
And also a lot of how to questions like I think one classic example is Is this one sort of that category? I think so. Like how many people could you fit in Texas?
Yes. Well, you basically have to break it down into parts. You ask how much space does one person take, and you can come up with a reasonably good estimate of that. And then you can say, okay, well, how big is Texas? And
Yeah.
it's in an interview. I can't look it up and see square miles, but maybe I have a mental picture of the United States as a map. I can see how big Texas is relative to that. And maybe I know that the United States is about 2,500 miles across. So I can estimate the area of Texas. And then with that and how much one person takes, you can find out how many people would fit in the state of Texas.
Yeah. Yeah. So in a way,
And
this
again,
is,
it's not something you know, but you know the various parts and you can break it into parts.
yeah, exactly. I think there are many similar examples, like how much does the Empire State Building weigh?
Yes,
Uh,
that's a really tough one they ask at Apple. But you can break it down and come up with a sensible answer.
Yeah, exactly. So I think again, this is really fun book to read. I know we're about at time, Bill, but I think I only just picked a few that's
Yeah.
really kind of scattered all around the book, and then there are many, and those are, as Bill mentioned, many of them are real. I think probably all of them are real questions being asked at this, employers. So first of all, it's really practical to help you if you're really preparing for an interview.
Mhm.
And then to understand this type of questions. And the second, I think even without sort of the imminent need for an interview, understanding those questions and the sort of a psychological base behind it is actually, it's very eye-opening, right? I
Yeah,
think,
it tells you something about psychology. It
yeah,
tells you something about, again, the whole theory of how you should approach a novel situation or problem. As I say, a lot of the chapters are grouped around principles from George Polya or other people like that. And you can learn to recognize situations like pay attention to unexpected words, again, break a problem down into parts. There's all these various pointers that are useful again and again and again. So it's something that, you need to have that on the tip of your mind.
yeah, yeah. As Bill said, I think it's a really sort of condition your mind for that kind of, not the interview question, because the interview question is something very practical. Like it's something like, yeah, if you have some real practical use, this is again an excellent, almost the guidebook for it. But I think even like for me reading that book, I was like, wow, this is the type of things oftentimes you forget, like how you should be, approaching, this kind of problems. And those problems are not necessarily only in interviews. It's actually in your life, it's in your work,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
running a business, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Polya regarded his book as being, totally practical in everyday life. So there's an element of that in here, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, indeed. And as I said earlier, if you're a parent, you have, from a, 10 to 16-year-old kids at home, I think this is a good book for some family table and dinner table conversations as well.
Yeah.
It really broaden the mind of the kids, and it's like, it's not like singular thinking. Yeah. And then last question I have for you, Bill, is that how, I'm actually fascinated about yourself, like, how you read so many different books. What's your thinking process? Like when you're approaching, like, is this something similar to this book? Like, when you write this book, you have to really approach this, of course, also as a problem.
Mhm.
It's a problem, you somehow have to give it a different dimension, right? And both in terms of longitudinal going down in time, or you go, down to, like George Polya, like
Yeah.
his fundamental way of thinking. Like, how do
Mhm.
you approach a problem, a complex, ambiguous problem like that when you come up with
Mhm.
a book? I think that the reader
Yeah.
will really benefit from that as well.
Mhm. Well, of course, I'm a big reader myself. And when I find a topic that really kind of appeals to me, where there's a kind of passion for it, I just start reading more and more about a particular topic or a person or idea. And eventually, I often find that I can write a whole book about it. But again, the important thing is really having the passion for the topic. And if you have that, the book kind of writes itself.
Yeah, yeah. And also the way you structured it, I think it's very, I would say, reader friendly.
Yeah.
Yeah, because because I know you must have done so much research, but when you present it, it has to be something with a very easy interface.
Yeah.
For the reader. Yeah, and then I think that's the beauty of this book as well. It's actually I can only imagine how much work and how many hours of reading and research you've done for the material of this book, but then kind of structure it in a dialogue with the reader.
Yeah.
Yeah, like is that something that guides you as well? Like you're writing for almost as like you're writing for a reader. You're not just writing to.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. Every book is different. I've done 17 books now. And I sort of regard these interview question books as maybe a little atypical in what I've done.
Right.
But still, as you say, you have to decide who the reader is and then speak to that person.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I certainly felt I'm one of that person. So
Well, good.
wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, Bill. And
Yes.
then I'll say something in Chinese, and it's like, so for people to get the book.
嗯
刚才我跟 Bill 的对话里面，基本上大概把他书里的一些精华讲了一下，但是实际上这个书里的精华特别特别多，有很多很多非常有意思的问题，然后这些问题下面的整个相关的历史和研究，所以大家非常感谢战卢把这本书引进到中国的市场，所以大家可以在直播间看到这本书的中文版。然后如果大家能读英文版的话，那英文版的书也非常非常好看。Okay, all right. I just said, we only covered, probably 2% of the book, 1 hour we have. And there's so much more people can gain or readers can gain as myself from reading the book itself. So I hope they can, retrieve the book for themselves and enjoy reading. Alrighty. Any last words or thoughts you want to share with the readers or audience in China?
Well, just that it's been great meeting you, and I'm glad the book is coming out in China.
Yeah, alrighty. Okay, thank you so much again for all the work behind it, and then we can be on the receiving end of all this wisdom.
Great.
All right, wonderful. Okay, I think okay, are we okay? Angus?